This morning, I would like to draw our mind to a remarkable woman by the name of Abigail. And it is just incidental that my granddaughter's name is Abigail. But I want to speak this morning about the remarkable women that we know, people that we love. Maybe your wife comes to mind, maybe your mother, a friend, or whatever the case might be. But I want to speak about a woman that has done so much good in her life as a woman in a very difficult environment in the Old Testament. But I want to start with a story. In November 1985, there was a story written by the Weekly World News, and they reported about a wealthy couple in Switzerland. They've got into an argument, and they were very, very upset with each other. And the reason is because the husband cancelled a vacation for both of them. His wife was so angry with him that she poured baking soda into her husband's fish tank and killed his entire collection of rare tropical fish. Now the husband says, well, if that's what you're going to be doing, and then what he did, he took all her diamond jewelry and threw it into the garbage disposal. I wish I was there. I'd be in like Flynn, boy. She then decided and said, well, is that what you can do? I can up you one. Took his stereo equipment and threw it into the pool. And then he threw bleach into her closet and ruined all her clothes. She then turned around and said, okay. She then took yellow paint and threw it all over his blue Ferrari. And then he said, okay. And then he kicked a hole in her Picasso painting. And then she says, okay. Raise you one, what they say? Equal one and raise you one. And then she went and she sank his sailboat. At this time, his daughter basically said, look, this is enough. This has gone crazy. So she called the police. The police arrived and they said, look, as the law works, it's not illegal to destroy your own property. So that's pretty much how it goes. And isn't that exactly what happens? They eventually went to see an attorney who tried to mediate between these two fools. And that's sometimes exactly how disputes spiral out of control. There was a wonderful story that struck me about Abigail. You know, there are two men in the Bible, in this account that we're going to be studying, David and Nabal. But there's one person in the story, a marvelous woman. Her name is Abigail, who intervened in a very difficult situation that could easily have literally spiraled out of control. I'm not quite sure if you've had some difficulty in your life where people have been downright nasty, subversive, and absolutely terrible with you. Treated you badly, lied about you, coerced, gossiped, slandered about you, and you've just had to keep quiet. The Bible talks to us, and there's a golden rule that my mother taught me: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And I remember a good friend, as we were growing up, he said, well, I wish we could have changed that and say, do unto others as others have done unto you. And I'm sure we all have been at that place where we say, okay, see you one, raise you one. A preacher once made a comment that really struck with me, and he said, getting equal with people is literally becoming like them. And the question always is, would you really like to be like the person who has done you in, person who has done you wrong? You see, because in essence, in order for you to get equal with them, you need to be like them and become like them. In fact, if you see you one, raise you one, you will then become worse than them. And so we turn to the story of David and Saul. Saul, as you and I know, was a narcissistic leader, and he basically pursued David all over Jerusalem and all over Israel. And then we pick up the story in 1 Samuel chapter 25. Here we find in chapter 25, he says, "So now Samuel died, and all of Israel assembled and mourned for him. And they buried him at the home in Ramah." He said, David moved down to the desert of Paran. And so here we find David moving into an area pretty much called the no man's land of that time. Very much the wild, wild west. If you know the story of Mufasa, he spoke to his young boy and he says, that's the Badlands. Nobody goes there. But at this time he had to run because Saul was after him. But not alone, he had 600 men that was with him. And so under his leadership, he was pretty much the leader of this band of fellas that really and truly were just the cast-outs. They were not happy with the leadership of Saul, and so they said, look, let's just get out of this town. This clown is ridiculous. But I want you to know another side of the story is that these men, basically because they were good people in essence, they would live in an area which was pretty bad. But they decided to do good in that area, pretty much the kind of John Wayne kind of vibe of these guys. And they used to look after all the sheep and the animals so that the bad guys wouldn't raid that area. And so they were pretty much the peacekeepers of the area there. And David and his men, because of their very character, provided incredible protection to everybody. But also, during that time, remember he had 600 men's mouths to feed. He also would then expect the people for whom they were working at the time to then help and also give them something in return. Like you and I often, when we get good service from somebody, and sometimes not so good, we always tip and we always say thank you for serving us. And so it is a measure of being kind. Now that's the context that we're looking now. Verse 2 immediately introduces Mr. Nabal. And there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. This man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. In other words, he had a massive flock of livestock. I want you to think, I don't know if anyone remembers the story of Bonanza that was on television many years ago. Who remembers that? Some of you youngsters don't remember that. Man, you are poorer for it. This was a dude that was on this beautiful ranch, and he was the Cartwrights. By the way, that place still exists, by the way, and it was actually run as a what do they call it? As a museum kind of thing where this movie was shot. But they gave him excellent protection during that time. Now the Bible then goes on to tell us, now the name of the man was Nabal. Now in Hebrew, the word of Nabal is actually quite a bad name. It is actually a bad word, but I want you to see how the Bible describes this man. They said he was harsh and badly mannered. The New Living Translation says that he was crude and he was mean. In other words, he was a rude individual, almost scoff. Now, the word Nabal or Naphal in the Hebrew means fool. So it's quite appropriate that this man would have been Nabal. Probably didn't even know his name meant fool. But he was married, very fortunately, to an incredible woman. Her name was Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful. 1 Samuel 25, verse 3. Now, the word beautiful in the Hebrew means in the extensive, in other words, the superlative. She was beautiful. She was stunning. And according to Jewish tradition, apparently she was one of 4 of the most beautiful women in all of Israel that lived and would live. So in other words, her beauty was not just skin deep, but there was a remarkable part of her that was incredible. She was intelligent, she was charming, she was gracious, she was kind, and she was courageous. In other words, Nabal, when he met her, although he was very wealthy, he married up. He married somebody that was spectacular. Now, isn't that interesting? Sometimes you find the most stupidest rich person marrying a remarkably clever woman. And you ask the question, I wonder what happened here. Anyway, this is the story. So the interesting thing is, I want you also to note that during that time of the history of humanity, we find that it wasn't really a mutually consensual thing. Marriage in those years were of a business arrangement. In other words, maybe a father was very wealthy, or maybe even he was poor. And Nabal would have approached him and says, listen, I need a good wife. You've got a beautiful wife. Can I grab her, please? Can I have her? And so I want you to be aware of the internal dynamics of where she was. Chapter 25, verse 4, David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. In other words, there was a time and a season where all the sheep were now going to be sheared. Shirley and Kobus farmed out in Sutherland, and normally they have a bunch of guys coming, and they would shear, let's say, 2,500 heads of sheep. And that was normally a very nice time, because all these sheep shearers arrive, they have food, and they take care of them, and they live on the property, and then they shear the sheep, and then off they go. But this time was different, because during that time, there was a lot of partying, a lot of drinking. And it's interesting to note that Nabal participated in this with the sheep shearers. I want you to look also as the story progresses. 1 Samuel 25 from verse 5 through to 8. So David sent 10 young men. And David said to the young men, go up to Carmel, go to Nabal and greet him in my name. And thus you shall greet him, peace to you, peace to your house, and peace to all that you have. I hear that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm, and they missed nothing all the time they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Please give whatever you have at hand to your servant and to your son David. Now, the basic idea here is, hey, champion, we've been looking after your shepherds, we protected them, and so all we're asking of you is to be kind. You've made a profit, but please, if you could, extend that kind of goodness to us. Verse 9 through to 11. When David's young men came, they said all this to Nabal in the name of David, and then they waited. Nabal answered David's servant, now watch here how dangerous this ground is. Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. And shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men who come from I do not know where? I want you to watch the derogatory way in which he speaks to David's men. Nabal's response absolutely dehumanized David. It was an insult of the worst kind. Who is this David? In other words, Kennedy money. You see, at that time, everybody knew David, that he had killed Goliath. But this guy insults not only David, but he denigrates his men, David before his men, who came in David's name. Very, very dangerous stuff. He even suggests that David is a rebel who has rebelled against the king. In other words, he says, you're an outlaw, you're a rogue, and you're a fugitive. And by the way, I am not interested in sharing anything that I have with you. He said, I've killed these things, I've given them to my men, and no, I'm not going to give anything to you. In verse 12, David's young men turned and came back and told him all of this. And David said to his men, now I can imagine David, brethren, it's not somebody you toy with. David said to his men, every man strap on his sword, every man of them strapped on his sword, and David also strapped on his sword. He said, that's it. Game over. We go and we escalate. This is not the best moment for David. I want you to remember that at this time, David had not yet matured into the man of God that God was busy shaping. He was still growing, and all the kind of idea is you do not control 600 men because you're a nice guy. You do not control 600 men and lead 600 men because you're a coward. You do not control and lead men along a line of leadership where you think that he is a weak individual. He's somebody that will not tolerate trash talk from a fool. And so he looks at this thing and he says, okay, enough now. Let's go. And as David goes down, I would imagine that a lot of things were going through his mind. As he was going toward this particular place where Nabal lives, his house, he probably thought, this guy is going to really see the rough edge of me. I'm going to deal with him in a way that he will know who he's dealing with. But in the story, I want you to watch the entry of a remarkable woman. In verse 14, one of the young men, and I really feel that this little young man that's close to Abigail was also very underrated and underemphasized. But one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, behold, David sent messengers out of the wilderness to greet our master. And he railed them. In other words, he insulted them. The New Living Translation says he screamed insults at him. This servant in verse 16 and 17 says, this servant saw what happened. He knew that Nabal was being unfair because he said to Abigail, yet the men were very good to us, ma'am, and we suffered no harm. We did not miss anything when we were in the fields as long as we went with them. They were a wall to us, both by night and by day, and all the while we were with them, keeping the sheep. In other words, ma'am, I want you to know that this man has been good to us. He protected us, and nothing of you and Mr. Nabal was stolen. Verse 17, now therefore know this and consider what you should do. For harm is determined against our master and against all his household. He is such a worthless man that one cannot speak to him. In other words, this clown was a fool, but you couldn't even reason with him, which is even worse. Because the Bible tells us you cannot reason with a fool. You can't talk to him, you can't speak sense into his head. This clown is on a collision course, and nothing's going to stop that. But if you think of the opposite of that narrative, I would imagine Abigail would say, oh, that's good. He'll just come and kill all the men and I'll be rid of this clown. But I want you to watch what this lady does. She shows so much integrity. She shows so much substance that she chooses to protect her husband. Not because he was good, but because she was good. I want you to note this wonderful, wonderful person, beautiful woman. And what she does is she gathers a whole lot of food, puts it on the donkeys, and sends it to David and his men. Verse 19, she did not tell her husband Nabal. In other words, again, you watch how she responds. The way that she deals with things, she says, this clown has been drinking all day. He's acting like a fool. And she says, I am going to respond on his behalf for his good. And I'm going to send food to these men. Verse 20 says, and as she rose on the donkey and came down under the cover of the mountain, behold, David and his men came down toward her, and she met him. David is on a business course. He's coming there, and he's coming to deal with Nabal in a way that Nabal deserves. But what happens is we watch this beautiful woman on a donkey intervening. The idea of a donkey, brethren, is not the idea of hee-haw down the road. A donkey was a matter of royalty. And so you find this beautiful woman. I can just imagine how beautiful she must be. She arrives there and she sees David. I want you to look at how she deals with David. She basically comes down and she says to him the following, verse 21 to 22. There's a discussion between them. Surely in vain have I guarded all that this fellow has in the wilderness. so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him. He's returned me evil for good. And God do so to the enemies of David and more, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belongs to him. I want you to look at this man. He's not your average Joe. He wasn't shaped in the world with little golden spoons and little mealy-mouthed little Lord Fauntleroy. This man was shaped in battle. And he knows exactly how to deal with a man like Nabal. But Abigail arrives, and I want you to watch what she does. She saw David, and she hurried and got down from the donkey. She fell before David on her face and bowed to the ground. In verse 23. You see, I want you to see the wife of a wealthy man. David is a fugitive, despised by her husband. And she jumps before him and she says, I am going to fall before this man and put myself at his mercy. And then she makes this comment, which I must be honest, I've not seen before. But when I read this text, it reminds me so much of Jesus. She falls on her face and she says, on me, my Lord, be the guilt. She did nothing to aggravate this man. But she's the one that says, I'll take the blame. Deal with me as an intermediary. And she basically says, it's my fault. Please. And that's why I love Jeff's Lord's Supper this morning. He says, when you arrive in the presence of God as his children, God has dealt with our sin. And then in verse 24 to 25, she goes on, please let me, your servant, speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant. Let not my Lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my Lord who you sent. In other words, I wasn't privy to how he spoke to your servants that came in your name. In other words, he's saying, ek was nie daar nie, maar ek het gehoor wat die man gesê het. And she says, please don't pay attention to this man. He's exactly who he says he is, his name is. He's an absolute fool. Verse 26, now then, my Lord, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand. In other words, he's saying, Lord, please let God stop you from contaminating your hand with blood. Don't do it. Don't do it. The Lord must keep you. The Lord must constrain you. Verse 28, please forgive the trespass of your servant. For the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house. Because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, and evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. In other words, she's saying, whatever you've done, God has chosen you. Do not contaminate yourself with this fool. Don't do it. This is because God has got something in mind for you. Now, one of the passages I want you to listen to very carefully. She's saying to him, David, God has something great in mind for you. God has a plan for your life, and in his plan, you don't fight your battles. You fight God's battles. David, you're not a wrongdoer. Don't be like this man. You're a good man. And then she makes this comment, which for me is the most profound comment, verse 29. He says, if men rise up to pursue you and to seek your life, the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living in the care of the Lord your God. Brethren, I'm not quite sure how you were raised. I was raised by a woman, my mother, but also by a grandmother. And what reminds me of the idea of a bundle is that my grandmother used to take money and put it in a handkerchief and put it safely away. Do you remember that? I think still some of the women do that. They put it away safely. And whenever you say to a ma, ek moet gou winkel toe gaan om dit en dit te gaan koop, en ma says, gee my net so 'n kansie, and out it comes, she takes open this bundle, and then she gives you the money that you need to buy. Now that word bundle is exactly that. It's a purse. It's something to protect that which is valuable. And so what you were saying to him is your entire life, your entire being is protected by God. And it's kept in a safe place close to the heart of God. Don't let this guy contaminate you. Don't let him rile you up to the point that you would bring blood guilt on yourself. And for me, when I read this passage, reminded me of my grandmother. She was a feisty old woman, but she was a tough girl. In other words, he's saying, no one can steal what God has in mind for you, because your entire life is his, and you're under his protection. You see, Brendan, when I look at this, I'm reminded of my wife. And sometimes I ask her, can I have something? And she sends me to a handbag. It is an absolute mystery what goes on inside there and how many things are in there. But the picture I want you to see, no, it's not true. She's actually got a very small bag. She's a minimalist, by the way, so she's not like my mom. Anyway, but the key I want you to see is that this kind of holding together that which is precious is a similar term used with the hollow of the sling. Does that make sense? So in other words, God was there with you when you killed Goliath. In the same way, God had protected you and is holding you in his wallet. No one's going to get to you. Verse 30 and 31, she reminds David, that God is fighting your battles. And when the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel, my Lord shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause, or for my Lord working salvation himself. In other words, he's saying to him, David, you are destined to reign over Israel. Don't allow this fool's blood to contaminate you. You were called to something far higher. When you start to contaminate your heart, there will be regret. Don't do it. And so we watch David as David then looks at this beautiful woman. She creeps into his heart. And I want you to see the polar opposites. Nabal, an absolute fool. David, the chosen of God. Nabal won't listen when anybody speaks to him. David listens to this beautiful woman. Look, David, she says to him, there's only one fool in this story, and that's my husband. Isn't one fool enough? David's response to her is incredible. He said, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from working salvation with my own hand. Go up in peace to your house. See, I have obeyed your voice, and I have granted your petition. Women, I want to say something to you today. You are in an incredible position when you are dealing with your husband as his helper. You see, I despise the view that sometimes people say, well, you know, us as women are being pushed down. It's not true. It's not true. You know, the greatest role, the context you consider that rubbish is the world, man. But if you look at the context within this spiritual context, God has placed you at a wonderful position to influence the heart of men whose lives are absolutely focused on doing God's will. I want you to watch that David was encouraged not to take revenge, because he said, you are trying to not fight God's cause, but your cause. And that's the problem, David. This is about you. And the beautiful part is she listens. He listens. He says, you're right. I'm not going to kill your husband. But I want you to watch how God intervenes. You see, brethren, when you and I step back and you do not touch the lives of people, when people says or does things to you behind your back or in front of you, like this case is, don't respond. Watch what God does in verse 37. In the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife told him these things, said to him, by the way, listen here, you fool, you came so close to being killed. Watch what happens to him. His heart died within him, and he became like a stone. 10 days later, according to verse 38, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. His death was not by the hand of David. His death was by the hand of God. And so, brethren, often we want to step into that space which is exclusively reserved for God, because that really is not about God's cause, but your cause. And you're not allowed to be in that space. Verse 39, then David sent and spoke to Abigail to take her as his wife. And this is so beautiful in verse 39, but in verse 42, Abigail hurried and rose and mounted a donkey. And she followed the messengers of David and became his wife. I can imagine this girl must have been amazing. She probably went into a room, put on a little bit of makeup, had the hair ironed a bit, GHD'd a little bit, looking lekker. And she's on the donkey and she's off to David. Can you imagine the most amazing relationship that they must have had? And here we see that good truly comes and follows those who honors God. But you know what actually happened was David had many wives as well. But I want you to see that we have three characters here, different attitudes. First of all, we have Nabal, who returns evil for good. And here we watch that, you know what, it tempts us, like David, to return evil for evil. It makes sense, doesn't it? It balances out the scales, doesn't it? But Nabal is a fool, and he's not only a fool, but he's wicked. He withholds that, and I want you to listen carefully. He withholds that which probably belongs to this man and his men, who have fought for him, enriched him, made it possible for him to even have sheep to shear. And we find that he is absolutely an absolute thief at the end of the day. You see, the Old Testament motto of a tooth for a tooth and an eye for an eye was one that he quite rightly would have been able to practice. But we see here that David says he reflects and he emulates the sentiments of Jesus Christ. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 44, when Jesus Christ teaches the Sermon on the Mount and says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say, love your enemies. And brethren, that's exactly what God expects from you and I. We also find the Apostle Peter, who saw Jesus arrested unjustly. And he also responds and he says, enough. And he chops off the ear of Malchus. This Peter, the incorrigible Peter, in 1 Peter 3:9 says, do not pay evil with evil. You see, brethren, sometimes, and I want to encourage us as God's people, when you on social media see the kind of vitriol that's being spilt into this public platform, I encourage you, don't go there. Don't go there. It's not appropriate for you and I to respond to this kind of baseness. On the contrary, bless those. Repay evil with a blessing. And Peter would remind us that to that you were called. You got a higher calling. Don't become like these other people. The question I want to ask you this morning, do you really want to get even with someone you don't even like? You don't respect them. They will never have your honor. You will treat them with respect because that's what their position demands from you and I. But more than that, you will never allow them into your heart. The second question, what story do you want to tell down the road? What are you going to tell your children when they are faced with a similar situation? You see, David had become king, and he would be able to tell that I never sullied the throne of God because of my vengeance on people. He says, let people do what they need to do, if that's what they feel they need to do, but I will not respond. You see, when you step into a leadership position, you need to know that there's a high standard of innocence that must be maintained. Third question, what would you do with people that hurt you all the time? The answer is basically, you know, when you've got a neighbor that's horrible, or you're sitting with co-workers or even family members that are just absolutely obtuse, what will you do? God says here, because of your allegiance to Christ and the covenant that exists between you and him, which we reaffirmed this morning, he says, you are bound to me. You are called to be like him. Let it go. To do nothing at times is to be merciful. To be kind is to be like Jesus. And you see, this story intersects with a wonderful story of salvation. You see, can you imagine that you should be paid back for everything evil that you've done? Could you imagine the mess we'll have in our society? Don't do it. You see, brethren, in our society, there's a lot of good people, generous people. But let me say this. There is something that supersedes that, and that is to be merciful. Even merciful to those who don't deserve it. They have not earned it, and neither have you. And so because of the cross, that becomes the junction in which all of us must bow the knee. We then says, Lord, I will forgive. Why? Because I'm forgiven. And Lord, I'm not going to dirty my hands. I'm going to keep it clean, and I'm going to keep my heart pure before you. In closing, you might say this morning, Dereck, you do not know what I'm dealing with. Dereck, you have no understanding what I am going through, and you expect me to be like that? I want to say to you this morning, it is true. I don't know. But you know what? Who does is Jesus. You see, the person that has called you into discipleship is not me. I'm not big enough. The person that has called you is Jesus. And if you look at his entire life, it was marked by one single concept, and that's compassion. And Abigail for us is that intermediary. She steps into that space as a beautiful woman that she is, and she says, I'll take the blame. And that's what Jesus did. He walks into our life, Pili Sili, and he says, I'll take it. Please, my Lord, I'll take it. Please deal with me. Don't look beyond that, Lord. And brethren, so we see the wonderful story of grace within the life of this amazing woman. I pray this morning that a lot of perspectives in your heart has been shifted, and that as you grow closer to Christ, that your walk will just be more in depth and cemented in the grace and mercy that we find, and your faith will be deepened. Let's stand and sing our final song of encouragement. If you need the prayers of the elders, I pray that you come as we close for this morning.